By the time I took the overdose, I was absolutely convinced that suicide was the only option for me. I was so sure of this that it seemed more like a logical decision to end my life than an emotional reaction to my circumstances. And I thought that if anybody else could see as clearly as me, well, then they would agree too. Sometimes I'd find myself buying a sandwich from a shop and biting into it. And I'd pause to consider the craziness of feeding a body that I intended to kill. I would marvel at the fact that I felt hunger, or that I could be touched by kindness or beauty, well, I now know that I was just a healthy, living human being with a natural time of death just as uncertain as anyone else's. Eventually, after another unsuccessful attempt on my life, I was hospitalised in a psychiatric ward. I tricked my mother into allowing me into a pharmacy. When she took me out on leave, I bought more pills. I swallowed them in the bath, and in the brief few minutes the nurse wasn't watching, I took them all. I was sick as a dog, but I was still bloody alive. I didn't even bother mentioning it to anybody for weeks. And then one day I reported that overdose to a nurse, and I said I was telling her because I realised that I wasn't actually going to kill myself. In fact, I asked for a blood test to make sure that I hadn't done myself any damage. I don't know if it was the drugs, the space, the persistence of friends. They just called and I would ignore them. Or maybe it was just time passing, but something changed. I noticed that my suicidal ideation included thoughts about my funeral, the effect of family and friends, how I would be remembered. It occurred to me that if part of me was thinking about these things, then part of me must still be interested in the continuing flow of life after death. And that was weird, because if I was going to be dead anyway, then why did it matter who came to my funeral? If I cared about how I'd be remembered, then some part of me must want to live on. It meant that not the whole of me must wish to die, and that was really a shock to realise, because it meant that suicide was no longer an option for me. There was something liberating about having reached rock bottom, because it meant that the only way I could go was up. The change was so quick. Well, I replaced all of the suicidal thinking in my mind with thoughts about recovery instead. Each step in the direction of health and healing brought more optimism and energy for the project of rebuilding my life. In fact, I think I was happier in those weeks that I was discharged from hospital. I was happier than I've ever been in my entire life. The doctors call it hypomania, but I think it's just the relief of not wanting to kill myself all the time. I laughed, and I cried, and I relished being alive, and I thanked the stars that I hadn't died. I had a friend, actually, who visited me in hospital, and she'd brought her baby with her. She was breastfeeding him in the garden while we talked. Well, I'll always remember that moment, when I looked at her eyes and I felt this warmth inside my body. I remember the moment of connection so vividly, and importantly, I remember that I let that feeling in. I think she may have flicked the back to life switch on inside me at that moment. I'd ignored her calls and I told her not to come, but she was stubborn and she'd come anyway. Many of my friends did. Many of my family too. Well, none of them gave up on calling me back up to the surface. The pull towards life became as irresistible as the drag towards death had been before it. And so I'm here, for now, tenderly uncertain as anyone else about what my future holds.